The U.S. economy entered 2025 with a severe structural vulnerability. The foundation of the supply chain lacked the physical personnel to function. The baby boomer generation had aged out of the workforce, and subsequent generations did not have the population numbers to replace them in mass labor industries like agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. At the same time, the middle class was financially tapped out. While the stock market showed nominal growth, the injection of trillions in COVID-era stimulus had devalued the U.S. dollar, triggering significant currency dilution and eroding the purchasing power of hourly wages. Millions were forced to max out credit cards and take on high-interest loans simply to afford housing and food. Into this fragile labor environment, the federal government allocated over $100 billion to expand interior immigration enforcement. Immigration and customs enforcement rapidly swept through communities, removing hundreds of thousands of able-bodied laborers from an already depleted domestic supply chain. The administration then enacted sweeping global tariffs on almost all foreign trading partners. Because domestic factories lacked the workforce to replace those blocked imports, this policy acted as a heavy import tax. The cost of essential goods spiked skyward, independent of consumer demand, locking the economy into cost-push inflation. When you simultaneously deplete a nation's labor pool and tax its imports, you remove the structural shock absorbers of the economy. These compounding policies ensured that the working class would face a synchronized collapse of their spending power. Right as the cost of living spiked, the federal government passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This legislation stripped $187 billion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, removing the safety net designed to keep low-income citizens fed during economic shocks. Without food assistance, families had to redirect their inflation-eroded wages away from rent and utilities just to buy groceries. This caused the velocity of money at the local level to freeze, as households diverted every available cent toward immediate survival. Missing rent payments quickly triggered mass evictions. Millions of lower and middle-class citizens who were living on the edge of survival defaulted on their housing, generating a sudden wave of displaced Americans sleeping on the streets. As thousands of citizens defaulted on their housing, the federal response did not focus on returning them to their homes. Instead, the legal and financial frameworks of 2026 began to reposition this displaced population as a raw human resource for the state. Instead of offering affordable housing, the Department of Health and Human Services launched the Streets Initiative. Operating on a $100 million pilot budget, this program routes the unhoused directly into the civil court system for mandatory assisted outpatient treatment. Through executive orders, the Attorney General challenged legal precedents to reclassify the newly homeless as individuals unable to care for themselves. This categorization allows the government to bypass standard civil liberties and subject the displaced to indefinite, involuntary institutional commitments. The operational intent becomes clear when looking at where the state transports these committed citizens. The newly constructed wellness centers perfectly overlay with remote lithium mines, timber sites, and agricultural heartlands, the exact industries suffering from the labor shortages caused by the ICE deportations. The state utilized the mass displacement it created to legally capture its own citizens, funneling them into mandatory labor camps to harvest crops and extract the raw materials needed to float a domestic production agenda. Keeping thousands of involuntary laborers compliant typically requires massive security resources, but modern neuroscience offers a more efficient alternative. Clinical studies from 2016 proved that manipulating mesolimbic dopamine instantly alters a subject's willingness to expend physical effort by changing their benefit-to-cost ratio. Inside these extraction centers, the state applies this research by administering controlled combinations of ketamine and transcranial magnetic stimulation. As this diagram shows, ketamine paired with magnetic pulses disrupts the default mode network, dropping the brain into extreme neuroplasticity. While blank, grueling physical labor is the only input provided, biologically hardwiring dopamine to the act of labor. Swinging a pickaxe becomes their only self-soothing. By binding the brain's reward circuitry to the repetitive act of work, the state eliminated the biological capacity for resistance. They re-engineered the workforce to crave the very labor that is actively destroying them. To execute this operation without political interference, the administration neutralized institutional oversight. They fired independent data gatherers at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and publicly pressured the Federal Reserve, paralyzing the agencies that would normally warn of a collapsing middle class. When citizens protested these policies, the government officially designated loose political networks as domestic terrorist organizations. Categorizing the political left as a national security threat justified the deployment of active-duty U.S. Marines and National Guard troops into American cities to protect federal operations. On the global stage, the administration severed ties with the post-war order. In early 2026, the White House officially withdrew from 66 international bodies, including the UN Human Rights Council, and fractured the NATO alliance. Alienating core allies and withdrawing from human rights organizations ensured that no foreign entity could monitor the domestic carceral state. The administration built a locked box around the country to hide the biological harvest of its own population. The United States has moved away from a globalized free market democracy. The policies of the last year have transitioned the nation into a localized, carceral extraction economy. Because the government refuses to address the underlying cost-push inflation, survival costs will continue to outpace working-class wages. This ensures that the middle class will slowly default on their debts, providing a self-replenishing supply of displaced bodies for the extraction system. The administration has built a society where it economically breaks the citizen, legally captures them, and biologically harvests their labor to float a nationalist agenda.